I would like to welcome our guest, which is Dr. Mike Van Clef. Dr. Van Clef is the Friends of Hopewell Valley Open Space Stewardship Director and the New Jersey Invasive Strike Team Program Director, which he co-founded in 2008. The goal of the New Jersey Strike Team, which I'm sure he's going to tell you about, is to bring about greater efficiency and effectiveness to invasive species management. Dr. Van Clef earned his PhD at Rutgers and has over 25 years of experience in stewardship, in planning and research, in invasive species and deer management. He's worked with countless organizations and institutions across our state, and I'm so pleased that he's here to join us today. So Dr. Van Clef, if you'd like to share your screen, I will hand it over to you.
A little bit about the strike team. So our goal is to protect natural lands through coordinated and strategic invasive species management. And we are the only entity solely dedicated to doing that. Obviously, there's lots of groups out there doing lots of things. Our focus on invasive species is unique, and we accumulate and sort of reflect back out information from all the different folks in the field in New Jersey. So, basic categories of what we do: mapping, data analysis, reporting. We do lots of outreach. We also do training of professionals and volunteers. And, sort of the nuts and bolts of it is searching for and eradicating invasive species. And I'll get into it a little bit, but the concept is early detection and rapid response. So that means getting ahead of threats before they become widespread and unmanageable. And this is just a little about ourselves. There's lots of names here, and that is good, lots of different expertise, but we are far from any of us being full-time. So, on our staff, we have lots of people, lots of expertise. And again, we're all working part-time on the project. The steering committee helps us focus on, the statewide issues. And our technical advisory committee is really important for when we list species. How do we know what's invasive or potentially invasive? Well, this group of people helps us figure that out. So it's a really collectively a really large amount of information is contained in all those folks in the technical advisory committee. So, a little bit of context. I'm sure folks have seen this graphic before. How development has sort of marched across New Jersey over the last 50 years. Despite that, still we have over 50% of the land area in New Jersey is in natural cover. But to think that that 50% of remaining natural land is not impacted by the developed land would be a misgiving. Every bit of natural land that's left is heavily impacted by the large amounts of development around that. And we'll talk about some of those things, but I think understanding the context is important. We still have a lot to protect, and it's even more important that we protect it and actively protect it because of the amount of development that surrounds it. So here's some of the things, the mess we've made, as I like to refer to this list. Sure, habitat destruction, overabundant deer, invasive species, agricultural soil modifications, fire regimes are altered, stream flows are altered, habitat is fragmented, and last but not least, climate change. So we have all of these factors at play in our 50% of the land that's still in natural cover. All of these things have an impact on them. So here's some of the numbers when we're talking about invasive plants in particular. It's estimated that there's over 10,000 non-native plant introductions. Of those 10,000 plus, 1,000 of them are established. And by that, I mean, they were introduced by people, now they're out there and they reproduce on their own. They don't need further human support. So that's a lot. I mean, we have 2,000 native species and 1,000 non-native species. And that ratio of 2 to 1, basically, native to non-native is really consistent across geographies, strangely enough. And about 35 species of those 1,000 are things we consider to be already widespread. So Japanese stilt grass, garlic mustard, and et cetera. The list goes on, but it's about 35. So you see how it shrank dramatically, right? You went from 10,000 introductions to 35 widespread species. So when we were starting the strike team up, the thing that concerned me most, I was very interested in the idea of early detection and rapid response. So the question comes, out of those 1,000, all right, 35 or we know are widespread, how many of them are potentially invasive? You know, so these are things you can't know for sure, but that's why we have a technical advisory committee. That's why we look at what's going on in the states around us, et cetera. But the idea was, let's try to minimize how many more are added to that 35 of widespread species. Can we stop species from becoming widespread? So that was, you know, a huge goal of the strike team and still is. So it turned out that if you thought 35 were bad, what do you think 135 would look like? You know, so clearly the problem can get dramatically worse than it is now. And that's a lot of our motivation is, you know, a lot of times when, you know, tasks sort of can be categorized in different ways. And one of the things for stewardship is trying not to let it get worse. It's always good to try to make it better for sure. But sometimes all you could do is stop it from getting as bad as it would be if no one did anything. And, you know, so you have to have sort of everyone that does work with invasive species has a sort of an internal motivation that they understand that what the problem is, that it's likely to get worse, but it's not going to be as bad as if we did nothing. So that gives you some of the context and the numbers. So invasive plants, they're introduced to an area outside their natural range and they grow densely to exclude other species. So in this photo, it's garlic mustard. The plants are growing so close together that no other species could fit in there. So you could be a non-native species and just be here or there on the roadside, a couple of plants, and not invasive, not our concern. You know, it really has to meet that criteria of having being abundant and excluding other species, or having some dramatic impact. Just being present is not enough to be considered invasive. Okay. So some of the attributes of invasives are, first and foremost, that deer don't eat them. And I'll get into deer a little bit more, but it turns out that the rise of invasive species in New Jersey and the rise of the deer population in New Jersey were hand in glove starting around 1970. And it's not sort of it's not a coincidence. And also they're invasive plants. They're tolerant of a wider variety of soil types and light levels. They mature quickly and produce lots of seeds. So they're species that are inherently able to increase their population pretty quickly. You know, and that sort of makes them generically a weed. So this is the real, to me, the bottom line of it all. If someone says, well, okay, they're out there and there's a bunch of them out there and there's whole areas that are just them, why is that bad? And, you know, this is a very simple graphic to try to convey that. The bottom line is it breaks the food web. So the top species in this chart is called autumn olive. It absolutely can take over large areas to the exclusion of other species. It makes flowers in May that are visited by pollinators quite a bit. I'm not going to deny that. It is what it is. And in September and October, they produce fruit that is eaten by a huge variety of wildlife, from chickadees to bears. I had some autumn olive on the hillside behind my house before I got rid of it all. And bears would come and break branches off of it so that they can get at the fruit. So I would hear a bear in the middle of the night and I hear cracking sounds as it was breaking branches off to get at the fruit. That's fine and well. That's more than most invasives give. They actually have flowers that feed pollinators. They have fruit that feed wildlife. That's better than most invasives. But if you think about what would be there without them, if an entire field is covered with autumn olive, what's missing? And this has, I guess you can see my cursor moving, a whole list of species that would normally be in an old field. Shrubs like dogwood and arrowwood, hazelnut, and obviously wildflowers, black-eyed Susans, goldenrod, asters, milkweed. If you look at what they offer to the ecosystem, you see a huge variety of different types of flowers, fruits, and seeds distributed across the entire calendar. So that's the problem of invasives in one nutshell. And you could think of it as, well, shoot, if I'm a pollinator and in May, there's a ton of flowers from autumn olive. Well, what am I going to do in June, July, August, September, October? You have to, animals, and the food web requires a consistent and varied food supply. So you get a lot of something in a small time period compared to the community that it's replacing. So if there's anything to remember about invasive plants and why they're bad, I love all plants. I don't think any of them are bad, but the badness of invasive species is because the simplification of the food web and what that does to the ecosystem. We're grappling with statistics that are horrifying. Over the last few years, we've lost 1/3 of our birds population in the last 50 years. Similar tragically large drops in our insect population. And you wonder why, you look for reasons. I can tell you that invasive species are definitely part of the problem. When you've simplified the system and reduced food for lots of different insects, they don't make it, or their populations are smaller. Now what do the birds eat? Well, they can't bulk up for their flights as much. Maybe they gain 90% of the weight or 80% of the weight that they would have gained from a healthy ecosystem. Well, that's enough to not get you to your destination, when they're migrating. So this is the real important slide of this whole presentation. So I referenced deer. So the deer density prior to European settlement was about 10 deer per square mile. Coincidentally, so deer were actually driven to extinction around 1900 because of commercial hunting. So a hunter was incentivized to take deer because you could sell it and make money. It was a great conservation success to get deer back into the system. They absolutely should be there. By 72, they were about where they were in 1600. Okay, that's great, but it went out of whack since then. So in Hopewell in 2019, it was over 100 deer per square mile. We just finished our surveys for 2021. Unfortunately, we missed last year for obvious COVID reasons. And it was 108 deer per square mile this year. So it's not going down. Other parts of the state, might be as low as 50 or probably more like 70. But again, that's 7 to 10 plus times the amount of deer that there were before European settlement. And it's just a huge problem. That last 50% of the land area that's in natural cover is facing a deer population that's 10 times more than it was before European settlement. And one more sort of detour, I guess, related to this. What's the timing of invasive species? So I did a report for a stewardship plan for Watchung Reservation a couple of years ago. And I was fortunate that one of the sources of information was a botanical survey from the early 1950s. And I read it with interest. What did he see back in 1950? In that case, he mentioned that Japanese honeysuckle was a problem, one species. There was a couple of tree of heavens, and the Park Commission at the time had just planted a hedgerow of Multiflora Rose. And, you know, that was it. That was it. When I went there a couple of years ago, I think there was 60 or 70 different invasive species. Many were tragically abundant. You know, so if you go 1950, 2020, well, you know, that's 70 years. That's one person's lifetime. You know, it seems like a long time to us, but to nature, it's a blink of an eye, if that. You know, so in a blink of an eye, we're asking all the members of our ecosystem to cope with a dramatic change in the vegetation. So, and again, the whole food web being altered. You know, so it is, you know, the rate of change is what concerns me more, almost as much, if not more, than the magnitude of the change. We're asking our ecosystem to adapt in a very short period of time. And the loss of 1/3 of our bird population may be the response. It can't keep up. So emerging invasive species. So these are the ones that have the potential to become widespread. So when possible, we focus on these species so that we could slow down the rate of change in our natural systems. Further, the strike team, again, with our technical committee, we categorize every species as in a stage number. So this is the reason for it, is to help us focus. Which species are most emerging? Which are the ones that we have the greatest chance of eliminating or significantly reducing their rate of spread? So stage 0 would be something that has less than 10 populations, for example. So many of our species on our list, plants and animals, are in stage 0. And then, you know, there's different definitions, stage 1, 2, 3. The gist is they're getting more and more abundant as you go down the list. And we also maintain a watch list. We recognize that there's 84 widespread species. The slide previously was 35 widespread invasive plants. This 84 is that 35 plus non-plants. And then, you know, there's examples of stage 0 plants like sickleweed and Japanese spirea. And how the strike team works, sickleweed is a good example. Someone recognized this plant and said, I've never seen this before. Let me see if the strike team knows anything about it. So they called me up and I said, I have never seen this plant. I don't know anything about it. And said, well, let's look into it. Is it invasive somewhere else? Answer is yes. Okay, we know of one population of this plant that's invasive somewhere else and just got to New Jersey. What should we do? Should we think about it? Yeah, I thought about it long enough to go and kill it. You know, the whole point is getting out in front of things. We know this could be a problem. Why wait for it to cover hundreds or thousands of acres across the state? Get it before it spreads. So that's what early detection and rapid response is all about. And yeah, this is some little bit of fluff, but you know, there has to be some sense of what you can and can't do. And if invasive species doesn't teach you that, then nothing will. You know, you have to understand what you have a chance to have an impact on and what you don't. You know, so there's many species that show up and they might be relatively new, but I know from other examples that there's not going to be anything we could do about it. And it stinks, and it's just the way it is. You can't fight every battle. You have to know which ones to admit that you've lost and it isn't worth fighting. And then when there is one to fight for, you fight like crazy. And again, this is a little bit more on early detection, rapid response. This is a real life example for us. A beautiful meadow, had one Chinese silvergrass in it. we know from other parts of the state, other parts of the country, that this is what it could be, all Chinese silvergrass. So again, it's a no-brainer. Think ahead, think about what you can and can't accomplish, and say, I could accomplish killing one Chinese silvergrass and not having this whole meadow be destroyed. So that's what you do. You just have to get out in front of things. And this is a little bit more confusing, I guess, but the general gist on this is there's two main factors that explain why a particular piece of land has invasives on it, or a lot of invasives, or it doesn't have a lot of invasives. And what it seems to boil down to is when you have deer abundance is high and the past land use involved agricultural tilling, that's when you have your worst invasive species infestations. So there's characters of the plants that make them invasive. There's characteristics of the land that make them susceptible to infestation. So again, when you're prioritizing where you're going to work and where you're going to put your effort, you might be better off going to a place that has less deer and no past agricultural tilling. That's where you're least likely to have invasive plants. So again, it's a matter of how do you figure out prioritization of your work. And the key thing is really trying to reduce the deer population to the extent you can, followed by very strategic invasive species control. And when you have the ability and the resources, restore. But there is a hierarchy of stewardship. So what have we done? We've searched a lot. New Jersey's 5 million acres. The strike team and its partners, which are many, have searched a lot of land, detected a lot of populations, and eradicated a bunch of them as well. I'm not other than just mentioning these next few slides, I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but we are in our last year of a large grant with the United States Forest Service, working with lots of private landowners and partner groups to do strategic invasive species control. We regularly have contracts with Essex County, Morris County, Jockey Hollow, and the municipality of Princeton, and others. And we do lots of training. Even with COVID last year, I did a lot of webinars, and we ended up reaching 1,600 people. So we're pretty proud of that. Of course, there was no tabling events or training sessions, but we did a lot of webinars and reached a lot of folks. And this is something I'll stop on for a second. To me, this is where it's at. The strike team understands how much work there is to be done out there, and realizes we can't possibly do all of it, or even a significant amount of it. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we're really happy that there's what we call, from our statewide perspective, local strike teams. So these are groups that have dedicated volunteers. They love one particular site, and they're doing great stewardship work on it. So there's an organizing principle of folks that are sort of the nucleus of these local strike teams. Often they have regular volunteer days. It's every Tuesday from 10 to 12, whatever. And it allows people to know when they can plug themselves into the overall effort. And that quote there is absolutely true. And anyone who's put the effort in knows that it's true. You can make progress if you just keep going. You will get there, but it does take a lot of work. It does take organization, but it's inevitable. If you keep putting the effort into it, you're going to make that place that you love more ecologically healthy. Just as a reminder, the reason why invasive species animate me is only because all of this stuff animates me. When you sort of love nature and you see all this beauty out there, and you realize that there's a huge threat to it, you want to protect it from that threat. And that's really what invasive species control is about. It's not about killing invasive plants so much as it is protecting all of these other things that are part of the ecosystem. And New Jersey is that 50% that's still left is pretty darn amazing. There's a lot of cool things out there. Yeah, just giving you a sample. I mean, absolutely stunning things that are out there waiting for you. You just got to go take a look at them. Lots of things, amazing amounts of amazing diversity of dragonflies in New Jersey. Federally listed things like bog turtles that are much more common to find in New Jersey than there are in other states. Globally rare species, like northern metalmark butterflies, bobcats, and there's still wildness in New Jersey, which I absolutely adore. Yes, there's timber rattlesnakes in New Jersey. There's northern copperheads, the 2 venomous snakes in New Jersey. That is amazing that they're still here. Amazing. Black bears, amazing that we still have them. So as developed as we are, there's still bits of wildness out there that are absolutely worth protecting. And the general idea is, you want healthy ecosystems. If you have healthy ecosystems, they will resist major infestations of invasive species. So a forest should look like this. If you're on a trail and the only way you can get off it is if you bushwhack, that's a healthy forest. If you could walk through the woods off the trail and not get a scratch on you, you are absolutely not in a healthy forest. It should not be empty. And the reason why it's empty is because of massive overabundance of deer. All that empty space leaves room for invasive species that don't get eaten by deer to flourish. So I'm not going to go into much detail on control methods, just to let you know that we do these things. But the first really key concept of control is not furthering the spread of invasives. So we do put out a do not plant list. We update it every year, and we ask people to voluntarily refrain from buying anything on the list. And the list looks pretty long, and there are definitely things on there that people give me some kickback on because they love them. But if we refrain from buying these things, we're not making it worse. And that is always the first step to solving a problem, is stop making it worse. The old expression, when you're in a hole, stop digging. This would be the counter for that. This would be the example for that, is if you have an invasive species problem, stop planting them on purpose. So it seems logical, and this is the guidance that we provide. It's a 2-page list. One is ones that you're likely to buy, and then the next page is things that you're not likely to buy, but just for completeness, we put out the entire list of plants. And I keep talking about deer. One of the control methods, the most important and ultimately the only one that will be effective at scale, is ecological control. And what we mean by that is that if you have less abundant deer, or the correct amount of deer, a balanced herd, somewhere in that 10 deer per square mile level, all of a sudden native species will show how competitive they are. Again, the analogy or whatever that I use is, I could beat the fastest person in the world in a foot race if you tie their legs together. And that's what we're doing. Overabundant deer are essentially tying the legs together of our native plants, keeping them from being competitive against invasive species. So that's what's going on out there. And when you put up a deer exclosure, or you have a very good deer management program, you realize visually, you could observe how competitive the native species are when it's a fair fight, so to speak, when they're playing on, it's a level playing field. So that is ultimately where we need to be. There's other methods, biological control. So you find a species that eats the plant from the country that it came from, you introduce it here. It can work, but it takes 20+ years because you have to be really careful about doing things like that. Mechanical control hardly ever works. You can cut most things down to your blue in the face and they will keep resprouting. Chemical control is the use of herbicides. And, it's not my favorite thing to think about, but I just from many years of experience, I realized that if you're going to mitigate invasive species, you're going to be using herbicides. There's just no two ways about it. And, it's sort of by far the lesser of two evils kind of a situation. You really do have to accept that use if you're going to mitigate the impacts of invasive species. And we have technical guidance. I'm not going to talk about this, but we have technical guidance to which herbicides do you use and which concentrations to kill which things. So every single species on our list has recommendations about how to treat it. Because the worst thing you could do with herbicides is use them wrong. There's no point of putting them out there and if it's not actually going to have the intended purpose. So you want to use them the correct way, the least amount of herbicide in the most targeted way. But every time you use it, you want to be sure if you're using it correctly that it has the intended result and kills the invasive species. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through this list. I think anyone who wants this presentation can have it, but I'm just going to quickly list some of the invasive species that we have in New Jersey. Calorie pear, planted on every main street. It has become very widespread. It's almost to the point that I probably should stop being a stubborn old goat and call it widespread and not emerging. It's just very common now. Japanese Aralia, pretty horrible. It's really bad in some places, not so bad in other places. So I'm still happy keeping this as emerging. But yeah, thorns on every darn inch of it. Even on the undersides of the leaves have prickles. It's just a nasty, nasty plant. Beautiful, but nasty. Some of the things that are hard for people to take, including me, Japanese maple. I think it might be one of the most beautiful. It's nearly artistic in its beauty, but it's becoming invasive. So you have to have that trade-off. Is it really about us and what we think is beautiful, or is it about the health of the ecosystem? And I'm always going to fall on the side of the health of the ecosystem, even against my own self-interest in thinking how beautiful Japanese maples are. It really isn't about us. It's about the ecosystem. Norway maple, again, this is sort of more of a resource than something I'm going to spend a lot of time on the slides. I should be wrapping up pretty soon so that we can do questions. Siebold's crabapple, tree of heaven, probably one of the original invasives. The tree that grew in Brooklyn. I respect the heck out of this plant. It can grow out of a sidewalk crack, for crying out loud. That's amazing. Still invasive though. Different shrubs, common buckthorn. These are all things, if you're a manager of natural areas, these are species that you should know, that should be easily, readily available in your mind if you see them, to know that you should do something about. Glossy buckthorn. Barberry. We consider barberry one of the older invasive species. And by old, we meant started becoming a problem in 1980, in the 1980s. Again, a blink of an eye from nature's point of view, a blink of an eye. Jet bead, linden viburnum, multiflora rose. At least we're not doing what we did when this became an invasive pest, because the United States Department of Agriculture gave out millions and millions of free seedlings. So mercifully, we're not doing that anymore. But yeah, this was clearly essentially purposeful. Oriental Photinia, Siebold's viburnum. These last two could alter the structure of our forest more than any invasive species has done to date. Winged birding bush, again, beautiful, but it ain't about us. It's about the ecosystem. Different vines, English ivy. This is probably one that's responding to climate change. I've been doing this long enough that I'm actually seeing the changes with my own eyes over time. This was not an invasive species 30 years ago. It is now an invasive species. It has been invasive in areas that are warmer than New Jersey. Put the pieces together, sounds like a hypothesis that could be potentially tested. Seems that climate getting warmer is allowing this species that's been planted for 200 years to now become an invasive species when it wasn't before. Japanese honeysuckle, I told you that story. This is probably the original invasive in New Jersey starting from the 1950s. Wisteria, beautiful, again, not about us, and probably also a result of climate change that it's spreading. Mile a minute. It is everything its name says. Oriental bittersweet. Porcelain berry, another species that seems to be reacting to climate change. Winter creeper, Euonymus. The list can go on, and it does. Chinese silvergrass, absolutely becoming an invasive species, an exceptionally popular landscape plant. Garlic mustard, brought over as for medicinal purpose by the Europeans, and has become a widespread invasive. Knotweed, lots of damage along the Delaware River and other wetlands. Stiltgrass, brought over as packaging material for China before styrofoam peanuts were available in the 1800s. They used dried stiltgrass. Eventually it took off. But, you know, it would have been introduced probably for 100+ years before it became an invasive species, starting around, again, the 1980s. And again, that was when the deer population really exploded. Mugwort, another harsh invasive. So our app is out there. I'm also not going to go over this in detail because it's in the process of being modified slightly. So the exact steps that I'm going to show you, I don't have the new one isn't finished yet, so I don't have it to show you. But just to give you an idea, if you want it to help, this app does still work, and you could download it for free, and you could become a citizen scientist. And the way we know that what species are becoming more abundant or being found in which part of the state is because people are using their phone app to tell us. So it's crowdsourced information. There's no way for us to be everywhere. We need lots of eyes. So, you know, one thing that we hope that people can do is learn 5 or 10 plants. If you're not a plant person and you want to start off from scratch, learn 5 or 10 plants. You can make them favorites in this app and go to whatever parks and see if you find it there. You know, so it's something you could do to help out. You know, the more information we have, the better decisions we can make and better guidance we can provide to our partners. So it makes me look smarter if other people collect data and send it to me. Now it makes me look smart, and I would love if you help me look smart because I could use all the help I can get. So yeah, you could use this app, and you know, this is generally how it's going to still work. But again, I don't want to belabor small details because it's slightly different. But you could pick particular species by scientific name or common name. You could learn about them. There's an information button, so you could see pictures of it. You can see a written description of it. You could find out which sightings are in the area around you from the past sightings. Maps come up, so you can see what else has been found. You can make it one of your favorite species, so you could separate it from the 100+ other species on the list quickly. If you're just getting into it, it's helpful to not have all the confusion of 100+ species and maybe just focus on several or 5. You take a picture of it, you tell what the population size is, and it goes to our database. Actually, it comes to my inbox, I verify it, and then it goes into the database. Once it's in the database, anyone in the world could go to the website and download it. So on our database on our website, it still looks like this largely. This is all the data that's been collected in New Jersey. I believe it's now 40,000 plus records in total. About 17,000 were collected by people using the app alone, plus there's other data entries. And then you can pick out a site. So you can pick out a particular site in a particular county. You can look for a particular species at that site in that county. And then you could say, where are the ones that nothing has been done to yet? So if I wanted to kill the last Japanese angelica trees on this property, I could download them onto my GPS unit, find them and get rid of them. So anyone can do this at any time. And it's just, some of the information about it. And this is the list, the entire list of the database from that one particular site. So if you were interested in a site and we're going to try to start up a local strike team, for example, your first step might be to go to our database, our website, and look to see if anything's been noted there. Has anyone looked there at all? It might be that no one has looked at all ever, and you would be adding something to the database that hasn't existed prior. But yeah, this is the heart of the strike team, is people helping us by collecting data. And I think I'm mostly on time, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. This wasn't my first lecture with you, but I feel like I always learn something new. So there are questions already coming in. So we'll give everybody a little bit of time to just get oriented. Remember, you can ask your questions in 2 different ways for this Q&A. If you want to directly ask your question yourself, you're just going to type the word question. And when I prompt you, you're going to unmute yourself. Or you can just type your question directly into the chat box. So I'm going to just pull up some of these past questions that have come in, and we'll start there. So the first question that came in was about the link for the do not plant list. And I see one of the participants already put that up. But one thing that I'll do is, Dr. Van Clef, you said you'll share the presentation with me, and then I can send it to our RSVP list so everybody can have a copy of both the presentation, and then I'll also add in the link for your website and for the do not plant list.
Okay, perfect.
All right. So one person had asked that they saw some elm trees on the do not plant list. Is there specific problems with elm trees? And they thought that we wanted to bring back elm trees.
Right. Yeah, these are the ones on our Dutch elm disease was an invasive pathogen introduced to the US that hurt the native elm trees here. So streets used to be lined with American elms, and they no longer are because of Dutch elm disease, which was an invasive pathogen. The ones on our list are elm trees that were imported from other countries to the US. For example, English elm. So English elm shows invasive tendencies, so it's on our list. So it's not the native elms that are on our list.
Our next question is, how would you know that your crabapple is a Siebold's?
Yeah, that one's kind of tough, and our app does have identification help. So if you downloaded our app and looked, you could see, look at it, read the written description. But the shorthand is crab apples are extremely hard to tell apart from each other on a good day. Siebold's crabapple, the majority of its leaves, or a high proportion of its leaves, have 3 lobes, like a sassafras does, not quite that dramatic. Whereas other crab apples may have a couple of their leaves with 3 lobes, but not very many. So it's a high proportion of 3-lobed leaves is probably the fastest, easiest way to tell that crab apple from others. It also grows in shaded conditions, which no other crab apple does. So that's another, by location, you can, have a quick idea that it's sea voles.
Great. The next one came in when you were talking about the application. Would Naturalist or Google Lens app help with identification?
I don't know much about Google Lens, but is that iNaturalist? Is that what the
They just wrote Naturalist. I think you might be right, iNaturalist.
Okay, yeah, I think it's phenomenal. That was like an old dog new trick moment for me a couple of summers ago when someone introduced that to me. I was fascinated by it, and I use it all the time, especially on things that I know nothing about, like many types of insects. I have a lot of fun with it. But yeah, if you're starting from zero for any type of group, iNaturalist I think is phenomenal. It puts you in the ballpark at the very least. If it doesn't tell you exactly what it is, it puts you in the ballpark. So I've told people in the past to use both, the iNaturalist app to help you identify it, and then the Strike Team app to actually report it to us. So yeah, I absolutely encourage people to use iNaturalist, and the best part about it is you could use it for fun, just for fun. And our list has all the bad things. iNaturalist has everything, so it's more fun that way. What is that species of butterfly? It'll get you in the ballpark if it doesn't tell you exactly.
This next question is a good one for clarity purposes. Are invasive species and non-native species interchangeable terms?
No, definitely not. So non-native species are a very large group of plants. So species. For plants, it's about 10,000 introductions of non-native plants to New Jersey, but we're only talking about 135 of them using the word invasive or potentially invasive. So it's a very small percentage of the overall amount of non-native species that we consider to be invasive. And that's strategically, it's very important to know that if you're a land steward, you have to know what is a potential problem and what isn't. And being non-native alone definitely doesn't tell you that. You have to know whether it could be invasive or not just native or non-native.
So there was a second part to that question, and it was, what's the protocol for mammals, for example, for mammals that are non-native to New Jersey? And similar to, pythons in Florida or mountain goats in Colorado parks, is there any kind of protocol for these non-native animals?
Yeah, I mean, I think for mammals, the one that comes to mind is feral hogs. So feral hogs are escapes, and they start reproducing on their own. They do a ton of ecological damage and are doing a lot in many other states. And the last I heard, but I was not confirmed, is that we absolutely had a population in New Jersey. And the last I heard, it was thought to have been eradicated. So right, they were hunted, they were shot. But yeah, I think one of the quotes that I remember is, if you think deer are bad, just wait to see what a feral hog population can do. And fortunately, that has not mushroomed into a bigger problem in New Jersey, but in other states, it is a significant problem.
Our next question is going to come from Josiah. So Josiah, you can unmute yourself whenever you're ready and ask your question.
Oh, sure thing, Samantha. Thank you. Can anyone still hear me? Okay. So my question is, what's the difference between a Japanese tree and with different kinds of trees that we were talking about through the power slide? And what kind of wildflowers we were talking about?
So a lot of the species, all of the species, are coming from parts of the world that have similar climate. So they call it climate matching. So we're not going to have an invasive species from, somewhere tropical. Something that's native in a tropical area is not going to make it in New Jersey, at least for now. So Japanese, Chinese, European, Eurasian species, those are all the sources of our invasive species because they're places that have a similar climate to us. So that's sort of the long and short on that. And there are, you know, native maples and maples that are native to Japan, sort of like the elms I was talking about. There's Native American elms, but there's also English elms. So English elms could potentially be invasive here. It does flow both directions to some extent. So our goldenrods are horribly invasive in Japan. Our black cherry trees that grow in New Jersey pretty commonly are very invasive in other parts of the world. So, you know, it's a give a little, get a little, you know. So, you know, it's the same types of factors that are sort of homogenizing natural areas. You know, we're getting species mixing from plants that are native in one place becoming invasive in another place. And all the same concerns, you know, you're simplifying the food web in those places.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Josiah, for that question. So then our next question, and I'm sorry if I say this name incorrectly, Kier, if you
It's Kayer, but that's fine. It's Professor Glossy.
no problem.
Glory. I don't know. Glossy. I don't know why. So I have a question for you. Has there been any like bird sighting, like different kind of bird sighting in New Jersey, like recently? I saw a cardinal owl. Like
Yeah, I mean, there are climate change is definitely affecting birds as well, and native species moving north. So cardinals, mockingbirds, black vultures. These are species that were traditionally considered southern or south of New Jersey that have become much more common in New Jersey. And there are invasive birds. European starlings, for example, are considered an invasive bird here. You know, there's others as well, but yeah, there's certainly birds are certainly on our list. Not much you could do about them. You know, there's not like you know, ready to go strategies to reduce bird populations like that, but it is important for us to keep track of what species are invasive in New Jersey.
All right, thank you for that question. So we have a couple more questions coming in, but we'll just maybe stop taking questions now and just answer the ones that we have, if that's okay with you, Dr. Van Clef?
Okay.
All right, so our next question is, are there any particular native species we could plant that would be helpful in countering or deterring some of the invasive species to grow, or anything that could specifically help in our area?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the key things of, you know, we look at, so you have this problem, right, of invasive species that are, you know, basically reducing the abundance, along with overabundant deer, reducing the amount of native species. You could look at it as, well, let me go after the invasives or let me help the natives. And, you know, for folks that are interested, I would suggest, you know, going to Doug Tallamy's website. And he's written books like Bringing Nature Home. And the idea is understanding how much native species we lost. Why don't we plant natives in and around our house? And I love doing, I have a part of my job with Friends of Hopewell Valley is going to private lands and recommending native plants. And we have wholesale plants available to people so they can get as many of them as cheap as possible. But yeah, planting natives in and around your house, or volunteering at a park or whatever to plant native species is a great thing to do to try to fix that broken food web. And yeah, as far as what to plant where, you kind of have to have a specific about where you are. I could send a link to our website that has listing of recommended native plants, and it's partly because they're great plants, and it's also partly because those are ones that are available from nurseries. But there's a lot of resources out there. I'd say the Native Plant Society of New Jersey would be a great resource. Jersey Friendly Yards would be a great resource if you wanted to know what kind of native plants you could put in a landscape. But, you know, absolutely recommend doing that because it does make a difference. It really is surprising how quickly things like butterflies will come back to your house if you take some sterile piece of lawn and turn it into a little, you know, a little meadow. It doesn't have to be huge. You know, you'll be doing a good thing, and you'll see a response. You'll see those butterflies show up when they weren't going to show up just to land on your grass.
All right, our next question is from Professor Olasak.
Okay. Mike, thanks for your share. My question is, I teach landscape horticulture here at the college, and we obviously promote the idea of substituting native plants and non-invasive introductions to species that could become invasive or problematic. My question is, the efforts that are going on right now in places like University of Connecticut and NC State in developing sterile and seedless varieties of Japanese barberry and burning bush. Do you find this to be a worthwhile venture? This is a long-term commitment from these institutions, and obviously it's not the same as bringing natives back. Do you think it's a worthwhile direction to go?
Yeah, I think, you know, the response, and I've seen the research in different places or different presentations over time. I mean, obviously, if you have a barberry that it's absolutely a widespread invasive species, and you put it in your landscape and it makes, you know, 1,000 fruit and the birds carry them into a natural area, that's a bad thing. You know, if they work on these cultivars and they might, you know, get 1 or 2 fruit, you know, that come off of one plant. So that is obviously a dramatic improvement. It's not going to lead to further degradation of a natural area. I have no problem with that. You know, I think my choice would always be a native plant over a non-native plant because, you know, part of the things, you know, so barberry is invasive partly because deer don't eat it, but it's also partly because insects don't eat it. Right. And if insects don't eat it, then the birds don't have bugs to eat, you know, that kind of concept. So I applaud any effort to try to take something that's known to be invasive and allow it to be planted in a yard and not have it contribute to making the natural areas around it worse. That's great. I'll personally always favor using a native plant where it can be. You know, I understand a lot of, you know, there's a lot of unknowns for, you know, using natives in the landscape. You know, most landscape architects and landscaper, like anyone involved with it, they're so much more familiar with the palette of non-native plants that deer don't eat that are safe to plant than they know about native plants and how they'll act and how badly will they get eaten and all these other things, you know. So there's a lot. Use of native plants has come a long way in the last 30 years, but there's still a long way to go.
Great, thanks.
All right, our next question's from, our next question is, you already spoke about past agricultural land being very prone to invasion, but what other areas or specific locations in our state have you found to be highly invaded?
Yeah, I guess other susceptible areas tend to be places like floodplains and things like that. Things that naturally have a higher amount of disturbance seem to be more prone to infestation. And it's really interesting. And I mean, I've made observations, you know, over time where, you know, you're walking for the past agricultural land use in particular, you're walking in a very infested forest, you run across a stone wall, which used to be used by farmers, you know, when they farmed the land and they ran across stones, they would pick them up and pile them along their property boundary. So a lot of times that stone wall marks the difference between an area that was plowed and not plowed. So you could walk across an infested forest that had been plowed, hit the stone wall, walk over the stone wall, and find very few invasives. So it is sort of a fascinating thing what lands are susceptible to invasives. So the passive agricultural land use is a very strong thing. But to your question, I would say other areas that are naturally disturbed, like floodplains, do seem to accumulate invasives more than other, like say, upland areas.
Okay, next a question from Ken. So Ken, you can unmute yourself whenever you're ready.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Van Clef. This has been really interesting stuff. My question is sort of related to a couple that I think have been posted in the chat, but it really has to do with a point that just came up around, nurseries. I think well-meaning nurseries and other folks who are providing guidance to homeowners in the state are often strongly recommending deer-resistant species, which is contributing to this significant problem that you've just described. So have you found that most nurseries and landscape companies, once they're made aware of the issue of invasive species, are receptive to changing their recommendations, or is there a lot of resistance in that community to doing things that might benefit the ecosystem rather than, let's say, their own personal design preferences?
Yeah, I haven't seen that, to be completely honest with you. The nursery trade in New Jersey, I mean, they had a voluntary list that they put out to their own membership maybe 15 plus years ago, I guess. And it was like a short list, 10 or 15 species, but it didn't have any impact whatsoever. And I think that's part of the problem where, we obviously don't have any regulatory, we're a nonprofit, we don't have any regulatory powers. We suggest that people voluntarily refrain from buying invasives. But we're one of only 4 states in the country that have 0 regulated species on our list. So just about everyone else in the country is ahead of us in having regulated species list, where it's essentially the do not plant list is regulatory. You can't sell them.
Is that something that has been, I'm sure it's been brought up to the appropriate, governing bodies in the state, but is there much traction in terms of maybe creating a regulated species list?
Yeah, there was. So about 10 years ago, I finished the statewide invasive species plan, which you could find on the web. But unfortunately, the council that was going to implement it was eliminated by the governor at that time. And interestingly, so nothing has happened for over a decade on that effort. But interestingly, a bill was introduced a week or so ago, trying to get traction on that plan that had been written 10 years ago, and possibly doing something to move forward on the problem of invasive species. I think I understand the nursery trade's position generally. If I were growing Japanese barberry, my life would be much easier than growing many other things. Because it's invasive, it has these great abilities to grow under a variety of conditions. It's a tough plant. It doesn't get eaten by deer. So it's easy to grow and propagate and sell, and then you say, well, just plant some native species instead, or grow some native species instead. Well, they don't know how to grow that species. They don't know what's sort of lurking in the background that's going to make it hard for them to propagate and sell it. And we are learning a lot more about natives. There are, some really good native plant nurseries in New Jersey, but that's a small percentage of the overall trade. And it's just a matter of even folks knowing what to do with native species, knowing what species to use under which conditions, et cetera. And to some extent, the public sort of buying into the use of native plants. I don't think oftentimes non-native plants have been cultivated for a very long time, and they have characteristics like they're neat and compact, which is a desirable trait in a landscape. If a native plant were just sort of, someone collected some seeds from a plant in the woods and they started growing them up, that plant has all the wild traits that it has. it might not be as compact or neat looking. And I think there's sort of a learning curve that we're on it collectively. People are learning about native plants, but there's still much more known about the tried and true non-native plants, some of which are invasive, than is known about native plants.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for the great work that you and your team are doing. This was really interesting.
Thank you.
I think that's a good place to stop on questions. I know we didn't get to all of the questions. So if anybody still has questions, you can just email them to legacy@ccm.edu and I can maybe compile a little list. Before everyone goes, I'm just going to screen share with you to tell you about some upcoming things. So hopefully everybody can see this. We have 2 upcoming legacy events that I just wanted to mention to everyone. Remember, these events open to the community, free to attend. You just have to RSVP to legacy@ccm.edu. Our first event, which is April 6th, is going to be Finbar O'Reilly, who is a world-renowned photographer and co-author of Shooting Ghosts, a U.S. Marine, a combat photographer, and their journey back home. So that's April 6th at 12:30. And then coming up after that, we have on April 20th at 12:30, we have a professor that is coming from Columbia, and he is going to, Dr. Stuart Gottlieb. He will be providing a lecture on America in the post-Cold War world. It's a little bit of a tongue twister for me to say, but those are our 2 upcoming legacy events, and we have more legacy events coming up throughout this month. So if you want to know more about legacy, you can always follow us on Instagram. You can also find our webpage on the CCM website, and you can email us for any RSVPs or more information. So if anybody wants to screenshot this or write this information, I'll leave it up there for a minute. Again, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Van Clef for being here today, and a special thanks for everyone joining us. We had a great crowd and some really great questions. I hope to see everybody at our future events. Thank you, everyone.